Okay, so this is, I think it's class 14 in Touching a City's Soul. The book, this is what the book looks like. This is a collection of discourses and talks of the previous Rebbe when he actually came to Chicago to visit. It's called, in Hebrew, it's called Bikur Chicago, which means the visit to Chicago. And we, so we're in the middle, there's different sections of the book, and we're in the middle of a mimer. The first mimer that the previous Rebbe said when he came here to visit. And we're in section 6, which is on page 78, but we're going to review section 5. This is the last section of the mimer, so we're about to finish it. And then I think we'll finish it today, even though there are some very deep concepts in this section, which we're going to have to review, like give some background for, but I think we'll still finish it today, hopefully. And then next week, I think the plan will be to review, just to spend the time, to go through the whole mimer as a review. So there are a couple of people here who are not, who usually are here, not here right now, but I think they asked me for the recording. But there's also a couple of people who are joining now who weren't here the entire time of the mimer. So I just want to put a little disclaimer that a mimer is, it's like a mini prophecy, right? So some very deep ideas in Chassidus. They're based usually on a verse from Torah or a quote from the Talmud, which then is explained and discussed on a much deeper level, on a sort of a soul level, and on an avodah level, a way of serving God level. So it delves very deeply and goes into a lot of different ideas, and usually starts with a question and it looks like it's going off on a tangent, which is all these ideas, how they're being discussed. And then at the end, it sort of ties it all back together to the original ideas. So this may feel a little bit overwhelming for somebody who this is the first class for, or even I think Eliana came to a different class, but it was missing for a little bit. It may feel a little overwhelming because we're right smack in the middle of all the mystical ideas. So even the review, which is just going to be of the previous section, is going to be a lot, but we're just bear with it. These, as I think everybody here who's bear with it a little bit, it's these ideas that we need to marinate in. Like we imagine, this is like these are concepts and ideas, and just imagine ourselves marinating in these ideas, and we maybe don't get everything all at once in the beginning, and it takes years to like just keep hearing these ideas and marinate in them, and then slowly we get seasoned by the marination, right? Sometimes recipes say marinate for a week in the refrigerator, so it's like, okay, let's marinate ourselves in these words for a few years, and then we'll start to get a little tasty ourselves. So what we're talking about in general in this mimer, like as a general idea, is that we're talking about the idea of faith in God, and how it's necessary to develop it and work on it and try to internalize it, how the leader of the generation helps us to do that, and the idea that the concept marinating tenderizes you. That's true, Joni, 100%. We want to be tenderized to godliness. That's what we're trying to do here, make ourselves softer. So the idea that's connected to that is this concept that we've been talking most of the mimer about, which is das, which is a conscious awareness or sensing, right? There's 10 soul powers, and we've been talking mainly about the soul power called das, which is the third. There's 10 soul powers, 3 intellectual soul powers, 7 emotional soul powers. Das is the third intellectual soul power, and it's being translated here as conscious awareness and also as an ability to sense. So what we're talking about is a conscious awareness of godliness and the ability to sense godliness, and developing our das enables us to do that. And how do we develop our das? By really concentrating and connecting to the ideas that we learn about in Torah, basically. So it becomes not just an intellectual study, but it becomes also something that we actually incorporate into our selfhood, into our being. So the review just for section 5, which was a very weighty section, was that histalkus, which is this concept, histalkus is the concept, it translates as looking deeply, gazing intently. So this is a term that's been used to explain this idea of a conscious awareness where you see something in your mind's eye. You don't just understand it. You haven't just heard about it and understand it, which hearing about something means that you hear about it, it's still far from you. Like you can hear something that's far away. And it can also, and like we, even in English, we say we don't believe everything we hear, right? But seeing means that it's close up to you, you see it, it's making an impression on you, a much deeper impression, right? Like seeing is believing. We even say that in English, right? We don't believe everything we hear, but seeing is believing. So those ideas are true because they're true on a ruchnistic level, they're true on a spiritual level, that this concept of histalkus, of gazing intently, doesn't just mean gazing physically intently, but it's the concept of really concentrating and connecting to an idea so that you see it in your mind's eye versus just hearing about it. So that's what we've been talking about, is like the idea of das, like really being so conscious of something that you sense it and you see it in your mind's eye. You're not just hearing about it and understanding it intellectually, because a person can understand something intellectually and can understand something intellectually on a very deep level, and it doesn't necessarily have an effect on them. It can remain aloof. So we don't want that for Torah. We want to understand something and also have it affect us, and we sense the godliness that's in the idea. So histalkus, this quality of like really looking deeply and connecting to something, is the way that one strengthens one's emunah, one's faith. And it's similar to the idea of food and drink bonding the soul and the body together. And what does histalkus represent? It's the idea of sensing the holiness in the words of Torah that we learn, and sensing our sensitivity to the godliness in davening. Meaning a person can learn Torah without sensing the godliness or the holiness in it. And a person can daven without it being like a sensitivity to, like, we're talking to God, right? So the idea of histalkus, of developing this idea of like activating our das, is that when we're learning Torah, it's not just an intellectual thing, it's something that we really feel is changing us as a person. It's like we really connect to the godliness in it. And when we daven, a sensitivity to the godly ideas in the davening. And there's many forms and many levels, the Friedrich Rebbe says, right? Not everybody is at the same stage or state, even as themselves, one day to the next day, but certainly as other people of different levels. And we talked earlier in the maamarim about this idea that, right, that's the difference between what's called the seed of man and the seed of animal, right? That Bnei Soul have, the Navi calls it the seed of the souls that are called the seed of man, and souls that are called the seed of animals. The seed of man souls are the ones who see godliness, and the seed of animal souls are the ones who understand, and maybe understand on a very deep level, but it's still at the level of hearing, not at the level of seeing. And we compared these two, or we said that in the davening, the first two paragraphs of Shema are connected to these ideas. That the first paragraph of Shema is describing a state when the Jewish people are carrying out Hashem's will on a very deep level. They're really connected to the inner dimension of God's will, and that when they're in that state, other people will take care of the Jews' physical needs. Right? In the first paragraph of Shema, it doesn't talk about taking care of your agriculture or having to farm or anything like that. It just talks about Torah mitzvahs and a connection to Hashem. Because the Jews will just be busy with ruchnistic things, with connecting to Hashem and not spiritual things. They don't have to worry about their physicality so much. And the way that it describes the love of Hashem is b'chol lavavcha, b'chol nafshcha, b'chol meldecha, with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your might. And in the second paragraph of Shema, it's talking about when they're not carrying out the will of Hashem to such a large degree. There does talk a lot about the physical labor that people have to do, and it only talks about loving Hashem b'chol levavchem uv'chol nafshechem, with all your heart and with all your soul. It doesn't say anything about all your might. we mentioned, Myra doesn't mention, but I added to that from other commentaries, it talks about, the first paragraph of Shema is singular, the second paragraph of Shema is plural, and maybe that connects to this idea that most people, the Rebbe says, in our generations are more of the seed of animal, which is the second paragraph of Shema, which is the plural, whereas there's very few people, what we would call Yichidei Segula, special people who are in the category of the first paragraph of Shema, seed of man, which maybe that's why that's singular. The Rebbe does not say that, but perhaps that connects to something else. Another commentary says about the two paragraphs of Shema. But getting back to the first paragraph of Shema, where it does say B'chol ma'idecha, to love Hashem with all your might, the Rebbe says that you take the word ma'id in Hebrew, which is mem, aleph, dalid, and you rearrange the letters, you get the word adam, which hints to the fact that the first paragraph of Shema is talking about the people who are the seed of Adam, the seed of man, the souls that are the seed of man, because B'chol ma'idecha is used in that description of how we love Hashem, and it hints to the idea of Adam, because the word can be transposed to Adam. And that, again, that refers to a person who actually sees and senses godliness at some level. And therefore, when a person senses godliness at this level, that's called sight. It's not literal seeing, right? But it's like insight, the mind's eye, and really connecting. When a person senses God at that level, he does the will of God completely. So that's why the first paragraph of Shema, that's talking about a person who senses God at this level, refers to the Jews when they're doing the will of God completely. A person can't be that aware of godliness and do anything else besides the will of God, right? It's like when a person is so connected to their spouse or their friend or their relative or their parent or somebody, right? And they know that something bothers them, they're not going to do it because they care so much about the relationship. The relationship is so actualized, they're not going to do something that they know upsets the other person. They don't want to upset the other person. And they are going to do things that the other person likes because they want them to be happy. So a person who has that level of awareness and activated sort of relationship with God is going to be doing God's will. Okay, so that's like one idea. And then the other idea is that this sort of person is going to only want God. Like they're not going to want all the reward that God's going to give and world to come and all these things. They just want that relationship with Hashem, which is called in Kabbalistic terms the concept of ratzoi, which means that it means two things. There's two ways of translating. It means they're yearning for God, they're running towards God, which is like the same idea. I mean, you can see why they're connected, like ratzain and ratz, right? They're running towards God and they're yearning for God. They don't want any of the side things that God promises. They just want that their reward, so to speak, is their relationship with God. Like that's what they actually want and crave. And so this word ratzain, which is like what they or ratzai, which is the term that describes them, that they're yearning for God, elicits the ratzain of Hashem. Like Hashem responds, and it awakens Hashem's desire to be with the person too. And this ratzain on the person's part and on God's part, we can rearrange the letters of ratzain also to a different word, which is sinor, which means a pipeline, like a pipeline. And then, so that ratzain of the person and the responding ratzain of Hashem creates a pipeline to bring God's blessings into the world. It brings God's emanation into the world, meaning this by itself creates the vessel to bring godliness into the world, and then godliness rests on the person more, and then the person can see godliness more. Meaning, it's like one of these cycles that is self-perpetuating, right? They're yearning for Hashem. They're connecting. They're this inner sight and sensing elicits from Hashem a response that Hashem connects himself more to the person, which means that they're sensing and seeing Hashem more, which means they want Hashem more. Like it becomes a positive cycle. And that's all in the first paragraph of Shema. Whereas in the second paragraph of Shema, where it doesn't say the word B'chol ma'idchem, because most people cannot reach this level, it's referring to Hashem, referring to people, the group that is, called the seed of animal. They understand Hashem. They could understand on a very deep level. Their bina is very activated, but it's not at this level of sight and attachment. Really, really, one of the main qualities of das, of an activated das, is the attachment or the connection to the Torah that the person's learning, to the davening, to Hashem. It's like an attachment. So that doesn't happen as much with an intellectual understanding, or with only an intellectual understanding, even though that's a very important thing, and it's also a very high level, right? There's many, many levels in that, and we have to work on ourselves to get to higher, deeper levels of understanding. And we also want to remember that Torah is not supposed to be just an intellectual study. It's supposed to be something that we feel connected, attached to, and that we start to sense the holiness in it. And then this is just such a beautiful phrase. I'm going to read it from, right? It says, these people, the people from the first paragraph of Shema, the souls of man who sense godliness and have this beautiful like cycle, right? Remember we read, for these people, the world is a bright place because they see the inner core of everything, its true essential being. So we like, one of my favorite things to do is say, like, put that on a refrigerator magnet. Like, that's a good thing to put on the refrigerator magnet. That it's a beautiful place. It's a bright place. The previous says it's a bright place. Now it's so interesting because in Yiddish, this was a term in Yiddish in the maamarim for lichtiger Welt. It's light, right? Like licht is light. So we just mentioned last week that, right, the Rebbe, the previous Rebbe, his last maamar that he published, which went to be printed and distributed for the Hasidim to learn, which like officially it was his grandmother's yahrzeit, Rebbe Rivka, who we spoke about on Shabbos, but it wound up being his yahrzeit. I mean, he wound up passing away on the day that it was Shabbos, so it was printed before Shabbos, so that it could be distributed on Shabbos, and he passed away on Shabbos. But that maamar is Basi Lagani, which we studied one unit of Basi Lagani this past year in honor of Yud Shvat, which was his yahrzeit. But that is exactly what the previous Rebbe calls the world. He calls the world Hashem's garden, right? And to keep in mind, like we just spoke about, he lived under the Tsar, under communism, and under the Nazis. I don't know, there's three more horrible, I mean, maybe the Inquisition, like all in a row. He lived under all three of these regimes and suffered in each of them. I mean, it's not like he was in America during that time and didn't, heard about them. He was imprisoned by the Tsar, he was imprisoned by the communists, and he was in the Warsaw Ghetto. One of his daughters and her husband was killed by the Nazis in Treblinka. Like, he experienced this firsthand. And yet, at the end of his life, his final words to the Hasidim that he wanted them to study was about how this world is Hashem's garden. This physical world is Hashem's garden, that Hashem's presence is found in this physical world, and it's Hashem's garden. So certainly what he says about these people, these high-level people, that the world is a bright place, I don't know, it's unbelievably inspiring. So that's a review of the previous section of the maamar. So do we have any questions about that?
Rebbetzin, I have a question.
I can't imagine that you wouldn't.
I got 14 or 15 questions.
Sure.
But I'll narrow it to one or two for the second. How does this concept relate to kavanah? Like in the flashes of kavanah that we feel when we really are in the groove, and are they in a constant state of kavanah?
Well, the translation that they're using of the concept of this idea of das is a conscious awareness. So kavanah literally translates as intention, which is also a type of conscious awareness, right? Kavanah comes from the word kivun, which means a direction, right? Like when you ask for directions in Israel, you could ask, is a kivun, right? Like, which way am I supposed to go? So kavanah means you have a plan, you have an action plan, you're going towards some place, right? And how you're getting there. So it's not exactly the same thing, but it's certainly a related concept for sure. It's having a conscious awareness means that you're not just meandering without a plan. You're like focused on what you're trying to, sense basically. That's really the word that the previous Rebbe uses. So kavana, the way that we use the word kavana for like davening is like, what is your intention while you're davening? So your intention that you're talking to God. It doesn't always mean that we sense it, even though that's what we're trying to do. But sometimes we might sense it. We're focused on that fact and we want that fact, and we're right. But then there's like a bump up from there, which is like there's people who actually experience it on a deep level. So they're certainly related concepts. I mean, I would say that, in my opinion, they're related concepts for sure.
Thank you.
Okay. Anything else? Any other questions? Comments? My husband says alternative speeches. Okay, so let's start section 6, and I have my doubts as to whether we're going to finish today, but it would be nice if we did. But let's see. We'll see. Okay, page 78, section 6. So if you have it in front of you. Okay, so we're going to be talking a little bit more about das right now, and what that means and different ways that it's like it talked about in Torah. And we're also going to be talking about 2 levels of das. So I think maybe I want to give a little background. In many of the classes that we've talked about the spheres, we've touched upon this idea, but it's going to be mentioned here as well, that, right, we talk about this 10 internal soul powers, the 3 intellectual and the 7 emotional, and then there's an encompassing soul power, which is above those 10. So usually the encompassing soul power is called keser, which translates as crown, like the way that a crown sits on top of the head and encompasses, the person. It's not internal. Whereas the 3 intellectual soul powers are chachma, bina, and das. They really represent 3 different parts of the brain, like as a parable, right? It's not these are soul powers, but they manifest in different brain abilities and so forth, and 7 emotional powers, which are also internalized. Now, das is the third of das. Like we said, das represents this idea of connection. So here we've been talking about das as the connector, that when a person is an activated das, they sense godliness, they feel connected to godliness. So that's it's like the concept of connection. At the same time, das also acts as a connector in the spheres. So das connects chachma and bina to each other, and it also connects the intellect to the emotions. The das that connects chachma and bina, the first 2 intellectual spheres, to each other is called das elyon, the supernal das, which actually also is sometimes called keser, meaning it's like the same idea in some ways, not in everything, but in some ways. And then das tachton, which is usually what the lower das, which is usually what we refer to when we say das, this third of the intellectual attributes, is the connector between the intellect and the emotions, which enables a person to understand something intellectually and then also sense it and feel it emotionally. So, like, when a person learns something that's the right thing to do and then they want to do it, or when they find out something and then they feel it, like that's because their das is working, so to speak. But das is the concept of connection. So it's going to talk about this idea in this section a little bit. Okay. We're also going to go back to the beginning of the maamarim if we get far enough in this section, where we talked about Moshe. Remember, the maamarim began with Moshe. Why is Hashem called Moshe? He calls Moshe twice without a comma. So we're going to get into that connection of Moshe to das and how Moshe helps Bnei Yisrael have das. Like, that's really what we started with. So we're starting to wrap up the maamarim a little bit. Okay, so section 6, page 78. So the reconciling aspect, which combines and unites chachma with bina, is das. Remember, we said that chachma is seeing, it's like seeing, and bina is like hearing or understanding. And bringing them together is das. as it is written in Adam Nu Yada Chava. So again, every idea in Chassidus is based, is like a mystical soul level explanation of some idea from the Chumash or from Halacha or from Talmud. Every idea can be traced back, so to speak, to Nigla. Any idea in Chassidus can be traced back to Nigla. So how do we know that this is what Das means? Like, how do we understand that? Where do we get it from? We get it from a pasuk. We get everything from a pasuk, right? The most valid way to prove anything in Torah is through a pasuk, because the Torah is given by God. So if God says it, it doesn't need any more proof than that. God said it. So God said this pasuk, Adam Yada es Chava, Adam Nu Chava. So we learn from there that the word Yada is used here to connote intimacy, right? It's talking about the marriage relationship, to imply that he and his wife became one flesh. That's what it talks about in the other pasuk, which talks about when a person gets married. The same is true in a spiritual sense regarding the synthesis of the spheres, meaning this quality of das, which represents the combining of two into one physically. That's what it means on a physical level, is also true spiritually. And really, we would say that when something's true spiritually, that's why it's true physically, meaning we get to see only the lowest levels. We get to see the trickle down of a truth, that there's a spiritual truth in the world. And then because of that spiritual truth, the world is created through that spiritual truth, that model, and the world becomes a condensed and contracted form of this spiritual truth. So physically, this idea of das being a connector is we see it because that's how intimacy is referred to. But that's the trickle down physical representation of this idea that das is a connection, is a very internal connection. Does that make sense? We're getting it? Yeah. You have a question?
Say it again. Please say it again, Chaya.
The truth of any idea is its spiritual source. Its spiritual root is its truth. And whatever is true in the spiritual realms becomes the structure for creation. So this idea that das is a connector is one of the truths in the spiritual worlds. And so as the worlds become more and more physical, right? There's God, and then there's all these contractions and everything else. Then all of a sudden, and the world starts to be created through these contractions and everything else of Hashem, right? But the structure of the spiritual realities is imprinted in the physical world, which is why, right, why we say mibsari echsel ka. We can look at ourselves and how we are made, and that's a mashal for Hashem. It's a parable for Hashem, because nothing can be created outside of the structure of reality, and reality is God. So the way that God chooses to contain himself and his light and everything else is that becomes a structure for creation. So the fact that das means that the intimate relationship between husband and a wife is because in the spiritual realms, das is this concept of connection and two things becoming one and joining. So it becomes on a physical level represented by this idea of physical intimacy between a husband and a wife. And that's why the pasuk says, Adam yada es Chava ishta. Adam knew, it's usually translated as knew his wife Chava, but the word in Hebrew is das, because das is this idea of connection. So we start, because we're physical, our first experience, what we see in front of us is the physical world, and the physical world is a parable for, and imprinted in the physical world are the 10 spheres and the world, and then we have to sort of there's hints of godliness everywhere because of the structure of creation. So we're coming at it from two ways. We're coming at it from we see what the spiritual reality is, we learn about it, but what we see is the physical reality, and then we sort of try to go like this and get them connected to each other so we can understand what's sort of going on. Like Chizkiyahu's tunnels, where they had to dig from the inside and the outside, and then God made a miracle that they wound up in the same place. Is that better? Any other questions? Okay, so in terms of the spheres, so back into the text, in terms of the spheres, Adam corresponds to Chachma, because, okay, and Chava to Bina, the mother of the children, i.e. the Midas. Okay, so that's also like a whole nother idea, right? That the male side, the male aspect of creation is the right side of creation, which starts with Chachma, and the female side of creation is the left side of creation, which starts with Bina. So we spent time earlier in the night, we're talking about Chachma and Bina. So Adam knowing Chava, his wife, how do we know that Das connects Chachma and Bina? Because Adam is code for Chachma, Chava is code for Bina, and the fact that Adam knew Chava, which is code for Das, which means that Das connects Chachma and Bina. Das connects, like the male energy and the female energy, it's a connector. Female energy, male energy are like opposites in some ways, and Das unites them. What's the male energy? The male energy is seeing, and the female energy is hearing. That, right, the what we talked about, this idea of Chachma and Bina, right? That now this mimer did not go into this in a lot because it was really talking about one specific idea that it was trying to bring out. We know from other places that this idea that the male energy is more of a flash, like short-lived, spontaneous kind of energy, whereas the woman's energy is more developing, nurturing, building out, right? And that's why physically in the formation of a child, which the midas here, the 7 midos are called the children, right? The father's called Chachma, the mother's called Bina. The children are called the midas. That gives birth to the children, right? So like in the process of creating a child, you have a father and mother and children. So the father's contribution to the child is a flash, basically a very short-lived flash, and the mother's contribution to the child is receiving the flash, nurturing it, developing it, building it out into a baby for 9 months, and then also giving birth to it. So that is also because in the spiritual realms, Chachma is this flash of insight, like this like concept of like eureka, whereas Bina is like taking that eureka and unpacking it, right? Like a person could say like, I get it, I understand this, but then you ask them to explain it and they can't explain it. They can't explain it because they haven't developed it in their mind yet. You need to sit down with the idea and unpack it and analyze it and think about it and look at it this way and that one the other way and talk about it, and then you can explain it. So that's Bina. Those are 2 different intellectual abilities, and they represent 2 different like processes in creation, and they also represent male and female. And then after that happens, after the person has the eureka and the building out and comprehending and analysis and everything else, then they have to connect to the idea, make it personal. That's the das. And then once that happens, emotions are born from it. Then they connect to the idea and then they feel something about whatever it is that they just learned. But it's a process, and the process can get stopped or plugged up anywhere along that continuum. But we learn about it from the deeper explanation of this pasuk, Adam yadas chava ishtai, which means the chachma connected to the Bina through the quality of Das, like that. We're like retranslating it on a mystical level. How are we doing?
Rebbe, are there parts of the body like that? When I think of Bina, for some reason, it feels like it's heart knowledge, whereas Chachma feels like it's head. This is just instinctive because I haven't learned this. I don't know why I just assumed that, and then I wasn't sure about that. But I'm just curious if there's like a reference, or is it ears, eyes, like you were saying before?
There are parts of the body. That's a whole nother like full class that we could do. That there are parts of the body, and there's body systems, like the endocrine system and the respiratory. So there's systems that are related to each of the spheres. There's different limbs of the body that relate to each of the spheres. So there's like left brain, right brain, back brain, like there's all different ways of connecting these all different parts to the spheres. Now, so Chachma and Bina at the first level of analysis are different parts of the brain, and Das also, all parts of the brain. Sometimes Das is compared to the neck, like the hind brain, which is the neck, the brain stem, which goes into the body. So like the connection between the mind and the heart, and the emotions are in the heart, and then in the arms and in the legs. It's like a whole system. However, your intuition is correct in a significant way that the inner dimension of the heart there's an inner dimension of the heart which is connected to Bina, which is like a woman's, the way that women know things, which is not just an intellectual thing, it's also an inner dimension of the heart, which is called Ru'usa Deliva, which actually is going to be mentioned in this mimer, maybe in the next page, which is an inner dimension of the heart, which is higher than the intellect. In other words, the intellect is higher than the emotions in general. That's why the head is above the heart. The head is supposed to direct the heart so that we understand that something's proper before we become emotionally attached to it or excited by it, right? So we don't get excited and want to do the wrong things. So that's why people walk upright versus animals, which walk on all fours, and their head and their heart and their stomachs are all on the same level. We're supposed to be head, heart, passion, like in that order. However, the inner dimension of the heart is higher than the head, even though physically there's heart is still here, but the inner dimension of the heart, which is that sensing of godliness, it's like a woman sensing that kind of a thing, that there is. So there's truth to what you're saying on another level. Any other questions? Okay, so back into the text.
Yeah, I have a quick question.
Yeah.
Oh, someone else asking. Okay, which one was the right, which one was the left?
The right side is male, the left side is female.
No, I mean, which of these two Sephiros?
Chachma is male, which is right-sided. Bina is female, which is left-sided.
Got it. Okay, nice, thanks.
Chaya, is the inner dimension of the heart what's called Bina Yetzirah?
Bina Yisera?
Yeah.
Yeah, probably the Bina Yisera and also the Ru'usa Deliva, it's called, with Pasach Eliyah, which we daven on Erev Shabbos, right? You've Bina Liva Uva Halev Maven, right? That the understanding of the heart is higher than the understanding of the head, which is called Bina Liba. Also sometimes Bina Yisera, the extra measure of understanding that women are given.
Okay.
What?
I say, okay, thank you.
Okay, so in terms of the spheres, back into the text, in terms of the spheres, Adam corresponds to Chachma and Chava to Bina, the mother of the children, meaning the Midas. So therefore, and Adam nu Chava alludes to the bonding of Chachma and Bina through Das. Right? That's how we're retranslating that phrase now. On the simple level, the phrase means Adam and Chava were married. On the inner meaning of the phrase, it means Chachma and Bina are connected through Das. Okay? And now, that's what it means. That's how we're translating the pasuk. What does this mean for us in our relationship with Hashem? In terms of Avodah, this signifies being connected to God with the deepest, innermost point of the heart through Bina, right? So we said that inner dimension of the heart is called, there's an inner dimension of the heart that's connected to Bina, which is the contemplation and thought lying at the heart of his meditation. And that also connects to your question about Kavana, right? The contemplation and thought that's lying at the heart of his meditation. That is also, that's the idea of the conscious awareness of Hashem, which is the inner dimension of the heart. However, but via Bina alone, meaning when Bina is just in the intellectual setting, without Das, without that connection being activated, the matter would merely remain in the realm of thought. And even the depth of thought does not touch one's essence, one's heart at all. Bina is not enough. It's only Bina when it's sort of like activated through Das that it can reach the heart, and there can be a inner dimension of the heart, which is that extra inner dimension of Bina. That's the inner dimension of the heart, which is this very high level of connection to Hashem and understanding Hashem and sensing Hashem. How are we doing? Okay, however, when there is an enthusiastic arousal, I love the translation in this book, actually. An enthusiastic arousal of the will of the heart, which is Usadaliba, that's the phrase that we talked about before. And a person bonds with the concept he's contemplating, right? He's bonding. That means he's activating his Das. He's not just activating his Bina. To the extent that he's entirely engrossed in the concept with all of his bodily senses, this being an expression of Das, this causes Chachma to fuse with Bina. This implies that the intensity of the person's meditation brings about a state in which Bina, right, he's meditating, it's like an idea of Das again, like there's a connection. It brings about a state in which Bina, normally associated with hearing, remember we said Chachma seeing, Bina's hearing, gains the perception of Chachma. Bina now also sees. The Das which bonds Chachma and Bina is called Das Elyon, the higher Das. That's what we were talking about before, right? So when a person is really this enthusiastic arousal of the will of the heart, because he's bonding with this concept that he's thinking about. He's not just trying to understand it intellectually. He's sensing the concept. He's thinking about the concept to the point where he senses the truth of the concept. He's not just understanding the concept. He's sensing the concept, and he's sensing the godliness in the concept. That's what he's putting himself in to try to experience. Then Chachma and Bina fuse. So the sight of Chachma and the hearing of Bina fuse in this Das, and it gets connected, and that's the inner dimension. And then he has this, he has this connection between Chachma and Bina, which is Das, which is this conscious awareness and sensing of godliness, and that's the inner dimension of the heart as it's informed by the head.
I apologize, but I have to go. But this is a fabulous class. Thank you so much.
Well, we're going to end now anyway, but thank you for coming.
Okay.
Anyway, so that's the first idea in this section, meaning this is Das Elyon. It talks about Das Elyon and this idea of how we, like, what we're trying to do over here. There's a period, there's the end of an idea, and this is also at the end of class. It's already 10:30, and this is a good breaking point. And the next one is going to talk about is what Das Tachton is, like what the next thing that Das does, which is going to be connecting the intellect to the emotions. But now we're talking about connecting these two ideas of seeing and hearing, like understanding, the intellectual understanding, which has to be it has to be connected. The person has to connect to it. It can't just remain, it can just remain intellectual, but then they haven't activated their Das. If they want to connect to the idea and sense the godliness in it, they need to activate their Das.
And Das Elyon is Kesser?
Yeah, in other places it's called Kesser, but yeah, we don't, right now it's just being called Das Elyon, but yeah.
Thank you so much for having me. It was really, really interesting.
Okay. So
Is this,
what?
is this the first time that these ideas were revealed to the Hasidim when they were listening to this?
No,
Or
I mean,
were
in
they
this
already
format,
had some understanding of this? Do you know what I mean?
Yeah, these ideas are talked about in Tanya. I mean, not exactly the same format. Tanya is called the written Torah of Chassidus. Everything that we there's thousands and thousands of books, maamarim, sichos talking about developing these ideas in Chassidus. They're all based on the Tanya. Everything's based on the Tanya. The same way that like all the thousands and thousands of books of oral Torah that were written down are based on the 5 books of the Chumash. So the Tanya there's 5 books of the Tanya that's called the written Torah of Chassidus. It's all in shortened version in the Tanya, and then these elaborations and explanations, and each Rebbe has his own style and different things and in different manners and so on and so on and so on. But we enter wherever we enter, and we get whatever we get.